An axis of symmetry is a vertical line that splits a graph into two congruent halves. Oftentimes we abbreviate this as AOS. So over here, we want to look and see how we can divide this graph in half. There are a couple ways to do this. One is to find your vertex. And so here we find our vertex right here at 1, -2, which means the axis of symmetry is x equals 1. You might also think about where your solutions are, the roots, x-intercepts. So if you find your x-intercepts at -1 and 3, you can find the distance between these two values. And so we see the distance between these two x-intercepts is 4. And so if the axis of symmetry splits your graph in half, half of 4 is 2. So if we go in 2 from the x-intercept, or we could do it from the other one, then we find that the axis of symmetry is going to be at x equals 1. So there's two ways to do that. One is to look for your maximum or minimum. The other is to use your x-intercepts to find the distance, to split that in half, to find the equation for the axis of symmetry. Over here, you can't actually use x-intercepts because you don't have any. And so we just want to find the vertex, which is right here at -1, -2. And so the equation for the axis of symmetry is x equals -1. Over here, we see that the x-intercept is at 1 and 5. And so the distance between 1 and 5 is 4. Half of that is 2. And so if I go in 2 units, I'm going to get at x equals 3. You're not always going to have a distance of 4. It just so happens the two problems we had with x-intercepts has a distance of 4 between the two roots. Over here, you have an x-intercept, but it's repeated. And so you can't really find the distance between them because the distance is 0. But that does kind of make sense, doesn't it? If you have a distance of 0, half of 0 is 0, and so you go 0 units away from your x-intercept, which means that your x-intercept is also going to help you find the axis of symmetry. So the axis of symmetry is at x equals -3. However, some people might argue that, well, technically it's not an axis of symmetry because your graph doesn't continue on in both directions. And so if you reflected like one piece over the axis of symmetry, it's not going to line up perfectly. And that's kind of semantics. So I think we can all see why this might be the axis of symmetry right here at x equals -3. Over here, we might have that same argument, right? Like the graph doesn't continue on, so does it really have an axis of symmetry? But if we did consider it continuing on in both directions, the axis of symmetry would be over here at like x equals 8. And in this context, it's kind of weird to talk about what the axis of symmetry means because it's more referring to like how it splits the graph in half. And so at x equals 8, like that's telling us where our vertex is going to be at. And so that means that like your vertex is a minimum, right? And so to have the minimum costs of manufacturing the items, you need to manufacture 8 items. So don't forget, the axis of symmetry is a vertical line that splits your graph into two parts that are congruent. And since it's a vertical line, you're going to have the equation x equals some number. Note that you can use your vertex or your x-intercepts to help you find it. And if you had an equation in standard form, you could use the equation x equals -b/2a.